Hello, everyone. You're listening to For Those We Lost. I'm your host, Jennifer Sullivan. Thank you for being here. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, forthosewelostpodcast.com, and click on the contact button, and you can reach me that way as well. In this show, people share their stories of losing a loved one to COVID. Every story you hear in this show is full of heartbreak, grief, loss, and frustration, but they are also full of love and hope. We talk about how we are coping, we talk about how to keep the memory of our loved ones alive, and how isolating our grief is as the world wants to move on. You'll hear us talk a little bit about the vaccine and politics, and you may not agree, but I hope you'll keep listening because each person who shares their story on this show has experienced profound grief over the loss of a loved one. And that's something we will all experience. We all love someone, we will all lose someone we love, and we will all grieve. These are the stories of those we lost to COVID. Thanks for being here with me today, everyone. I've got a really great show coming up for you. Today, I'm joined by Dawn from Alabama. Dawn is a family nurse practitioner at an urgent care in a small town outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and she lost her father to COVID in January 2021. After her father passed away, Dawn wrote out his story and all the memories she had of him while she was growing up. Dawn's dad operated coin laundries in Alabama, and he used to find flattened, almost melted change in the washing machines and dryers. She fondly remembers him bringing that change home to share with her. So she started Pennies for Pop and encouraged others to share their stories of loss and love. And now her Pennies for Pop has grown into livelikepop.org. For context, we recorded this episode on November 30th. 2021. All the information on Dawn's Live Like Pop project is in the show notes below. Dawn also mentions whowelost.org and the Rami's Heart COVID-19 Memorial. That information is also in the show notes. Dawn brings a wide open heart to this podcast. She works in healthcare, helping others and putting herself at risk, and she lost her dad to COVID. So her feelings and her thoughts come from both sides of this pandemic. And now, I'd like to welcome Dawn to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you lost your father in January of 2021.
Yes.
And you live outside of Birmingham, Alabama.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. The other thing that you told me that I think's really important is that you're a nurse practitioner at a clinic in the town where you live.
Yes, I am.
All right. So you see a lot and know a lot about COVID and the community and just a lot about it, which I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm able to see kind of both sides. It's interesting to watch to see how this pandemic started, how it's evolving, how it continues to evolve. But for me, it's more personal because I did lose my best friend. I lost my dad to it. So throughout his time when I took a leave of absence, I became kind of an expert in COVID because I stayed on the phone with hospitals 24 hours a day for a month. So it was about every hour and a half to 2 hours, I was on the phone with either a nurse or an attending or trying to get the attention of an attending. So I learned a whole lot that I've been able to carry on to educate my patients.
So let's go back to March of 2020, just briefly. And why don't you tell me about how you first heard about COVID and then the changes that your family made around social distancing and that 2 weeks initially to slow the spread, and how that changed your life, your family, and your dad's family, and your interaction and all that.
Well, first, I remember hearing about COVID. I was actually over at my dad's house and we were having breakfast together as we usually did before I go to work. And he mentioned it. And right at the time that he mentioned it, it popped up on the news where they were speaking about it. And and then I was like, well, Dad, we're going to have to make some changes for you, which was my dad was a go getter. He was used to being out in the world and doing stuff. And that limited him. He had rheumatoid arthritis and pulmonary fibrosis. He was diagnosed with both in 2011. And while I understood the impact, he did not. So I was having to explain to him about the mask situation and staying home. And so it impacted us a good deal because he and my mother both, I preferred for them to stay at home because they're both in their 70s. And the next thing you know, my son, they switched to being homeschooled. His which literally at the time consisted of, I don't think, no one was prepared for this, not parents, not teachers, not schools. So, we went for a period of a few weeks to them just giving us a few worksheets, and it was just this whole thing of parents becoming teachers, and
Yeah.
then worried about my parents, keeping them home, keeping them safe, having to join ship to get their groceries delivered to them. I mean, COVID changed everything for us. It changed the way we communicated with each other. Because of what I did for a living, I wasn't able to be around my dad as much because I was just terrified because I didn't want to give it to him. So we would FaceTime more than I could have some interaction. And when we did have interactions during that time, I would go to their house and stand outside
Mhm.
from, at least 6 feet away, and they would just stand in the door, and I would just kind of wave at them and talk to them for a few minutes that way. So it had a pretty big impact on us as it did the whole world.
Yeah, I can relate. I sat outside the window of my mom's memory care, almost every day for months. And if the window was open, I had a mask on. And if the window was closed, she had the phone inside on speaker and I had my phone on speakerphone. But
Right.
it definitely changed things. So you continued to work, I'm guessing, because you're an essential employee.
Yes, as my husband told me when all this started, he was he said, "You literally have the one job in the world that can't run away from COVID.
Mhm.
You can't run from this. You're going to be submerged in it
Mhm.
all day." And to further go into the impact that it had, I've always been kind of a clean freak, but once COVID hit, we had a whole another procedure from when mom got home from work. So now when mom gets home from work, husband has a robe outside in the garage. I have to put that on, take the scrubs off, get them to the wash immediately. And my son would go and clean all the doorknobs that I touched on the way to our shower.
Oh, wow.
So we developed this whole nother process for when mom comes home from work.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. Well, it makes sense. It makes sense. I know people were wiping down their groceries, and we did the same thing here if we had anybody over at any point. And in fact, still, if we have someone come over and watch our dog when we go somewhere, I am with the wipes on the light switches, the
Yep.
doorknobs, the handles to the
Yes. Yep.
every cupboard in the fridge. Yeah.
And my husband would go behind when my son would take the doorknobs, and my husband did my car with the steering wheel and the handles,
Mm,
and for every shift.
yeah. Yeah. So, what was your dad? What were your parents doing during this time?
My mom, she has asthma really bad, so she also has several other health issues, osteoporosis being one of them. So she stayed at home a lot. My dad has been an appliance repairman since he was 16, so he cut back, but he was still doing some work where I got him an N95, I got him a cloth mask to wear over it. So he was very limited. Maybe, he would only do about 2 calls a day, but still,
Mm,
because
yeah.
that's all he knew since he was 16. He raised 6 of us and took care of my mom for 62 years. And so that's all he knew. So to take that, and he was always active in the community, always helping others. So I knew this was going to be hard for him. But for my mom, she was used to kind of being at home. She took care of all of us, took us to all the doctor's appointments growing up, and she was good. She was fine. She handled it better than my dad did. I'll say it like that. She handled it a lot better than he did.
Yeah. If he's a person that's used to being out and talking to people and being in the
Yes.
community, yeah, it would be really
Yes.
hard.
Uh-huh.
Well, and you also could argue that fixing washers and dryers and appliances and things like that is important when people are stuck at home.
Yeah, exactly. And he would get calls all the time like that. Our stove is broken, and I'd be like, "Dad." And he was like, "Well, they won't be able to feed their kids dinner." And he was just that kind of a guy. So,
Hmm. So let's go forward to November. And so you had mentioned you're the youngest of six.
yes.
And so you had a special relationship with your dad, and you told me this on the phone because you're the youngest of six, but you're also treated like an only child because you're so much younger than your siblings.
Yes. That's correct.
Yeah. So you had this relationship with him where you went over there every day and saw him for breakfast, and he would bring you
Yes.
lunch. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's go forward to November of 2020. And if you could just go into what happened.
So Thanksgiving was fine. I didn't feel like it was safe because, again, because of what I did for a living, for them to come over to our house and eat. So what we did is we prepared food, and my dad came over and he picked it up. Of course, my dad was double masked, and our whole house, which is me, my husband, and my son, we were all double masked, and gave him the food that we cooked, and I guess it was maybe 4 or 5 days after Thanksgiving. I was talking to him on my way home from work, like I always did. And I asked him how he was feeling because I heard him cough a little bit. So I said, Pop, are you okay? And I'll never forget this. I remember telling my husband that, Pop didn't sound like himself. And he told me something very significant. He said, I'm okay. I feel a little chill. And by the next day, I told him that night on the phone, we need to get you a test. And by the next day, the next morning, he was in the emergency room and he tested positive for COVID. And I remember when I found out, I felt like the world just kind of stopped because when the pandemic started, my dad acknowledged the fact that he did have two pre-existing conditions that made him more immune suppressed.
Hmm.
And he always said if he ever got COVID, it would be a death sentence. And that stuck with me. So I just remember being at work and my mom calling me and telling me that he was in the ER. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
And I was seeing patients, and I just remember saying, I need to leave." And so I left, and I ended up the next day. I took a leave of absence when he got admitted, and it was hard. I was just terrified every day, and his journey was somewhat confusing to me because at first he sounded like Pop, he was doing great. They gave him the remdesivir and he was talking to me. He had oxygen, but by nasal cannula. So he was doing good.
Hmm.
And I asked him, and he was like, I feel great. I'm ready to go home. And so it's frustrating to me. They discharged him to home after being in for 5 days. And they sent him home with steroid pills. And for someone who's immune suppressed already, and you don't bother to retest him for COVID
Hmm.
before you discharge him, and I get the other side of it because I'm in healthcare. He got the remdesivir treatment. I get the other side. There's a million other people with COVID who needed a room. I get that. I do. But what's frustrating is they discharged him to home, and 2 days later, he was shaking. He had developed shaking chills, and I knew it was pneumonia. And so he went by ambulance again and was admitted. And he still sounded like my dad. I feel great. And I don't know how much of this was him feeling great, like he said he did, and how much it was him trying to protect me because he always did. Even as an adult, he always tried to protect me. He always tried to shield me. Um, so he progressed and he went from having a nasal cannula to a face mask, and he was still able to talk with me, communicate with us. He was able to text a lot, which I was always joking with him because I'm like, look at that. Because he didn't like texting before. But I was joking with him, like, look at you now. You can text now. Because before he was like kind of grumbled at texting. And So he was able to text and talk to me, and we had some trouble with FaceTime. And he had one nurse, her name was Anna, and she put on all of her PPE. And I told her, I was like, I haven't gotten to see my dad, and I really like to show him our tree. I think it would mean a lot. And she told me, you haven't gotten to see him yet by FaceTime? I said, no, he's got an iPhone. I sent him because I packed his bag. He's got 2 chargers, an iPhone, but he wasn't real tech savvy. So he was having a hard time with FaceTime. So she went in and gave up her phone so I could see him. And I got to FaceTime with him. And that was December 11th. I got to FaceTime with him for about 3.5 hours, which is, I'll never forget it, because it was around 11 p.m. at night. And as soon as we saw each other, we both just started crying a little. So we're so happy to see each other. But shortly after that, he went from the face mask to the BiPAP, and he didn't like the BiPAP, but he he kept telling me it makes it harder to breathe with this BiPAP, and it was just so crazy because I was having a hard time communicating. I couldn't get physicians to talk to me a lot about what was going on, and he went from BiPAP. He did well with the BiPAP, even though he didn't like it. He still did it, and they told him that he could take the BiPAP off for a few minutes and talk to me. But soon it got to where, and this part's really hard, where they told me not to talk to him because it would use up too much of his oxygen. And I said, well, you know, what if y'all just hold the phone, let him hold the phone and let me talk? I don't see any harm with that. He doesn't have to talk back, but at least let me talk to him. And I got a call one night, and they said that he was agitated on the BiPAP and that he was going to need to be put on the ventilator. And, would I be okay with that? And I just, I just remember saying I'll be right there, because I developed a rapport with the nurses, and they knew I was a practitioner, and they very graciously allowed me to come in and talk about a walk. I'll never forget that walk that night. He was put on the ventilator because I remember the color scrubs I was wearing. They were gray. I remember the lighting in the hospital, and I remember the hallway, and it was the longest walk in a hallway I'd ever made in my entire life to get to the ICU. And seeing him like that was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to see as a healthcare worker, as a daughter. So they let me stay. They let me stay in his room. And my husband was outside the hospital in the car. And they let me stay with him for like 4 hours that night. And I laid there next to him in the bed, then told him how much I loved him. And I felt like the time I was there, all of his vital signs improved. I would tell him, look at that. Your oxygen, everything's getting better. You must know that I'm here. But that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, was to see it like that. So I went from seeing my dad, who was everything to me every single day, and seeing him before work, and seeing him at my clinic for lunch, talking to him on the way home to nothing in 4 weeks. So that's a for me, I took it more personally because here I am. I'm a nurse practitioner and and why can't I save him? I can help all these other people and why can't I save him? What if I would have, spotted symptoms sooner than what I did? I just question myself all the time because here I am. He gave me my education. And I mean, he gave me my education. My dad said, as long as you make good grades, I will cover the cost of your education because I believe in you. I love you. You're incredible. You're intelligent. And I want to see you go as far as you can go. So he gave this to me. And it's like I couldn't help him. And that's what's hard for me is was not being able to help him more than what I did.
Yeah. Were you able to go in any other time after that and see him?
Yes, I was. Oddly enough, um, after he was put on the ventilator, I guess maybe 2 or 3 days before he died, someone from the hospital called me. It was it wasn't one of my dad's regular nurses. It was a fill-in because his regular nurse was tied up doing something else. Well, this nurse got my dad confused with the man next door to my dad who was around the same age, was on the same vent settings, was taking similar medications. And they told me that my dad was going to die that night and I needed to get down to the hospital immediately.
Oh,
So I rushed down to the hospital immediately. When I get there, I was greeted with a charge nurse. The charge nurse said, I apologize. It is not your dad. It is the man next door to your dad. And I was just like, what in the world? How did that happen? You know, and it was very sad. I did get to stay with my dad a little that night, which I'm very grateful for. The man that was next to my dad did in fact code and he passed while I was there. So that hit close to home.
yeah, I can imagine. And one question I have during this time, your mom, how were things for her?
For
Yeah.
my mom tested positive after my dad was admitted to the hospital.
Oh,
She tested positive, which was scary because she has asthma. Thankfully enough, she didn't get very many symptoms. She had a headache and dizziness, and that was it.
wow.
Which I'm very thankful for. Anybody out there who's got parents that you don't want to see them, you never want to see them ill,
Hmm.
and you certainly don't want to see them ill at the same time, especially when it comes to something like COVID. So thankfully, we kept her at home, closely monitored her. She was more worried about my dad,
Yeah.
and understandably so. And it was hard having to communicate with her because the night that he got put on the ventilator, I had to I had to drive to her house and tell her that in the middle of the night. And my husband and I knocked on the door and she just looked at me and all of about 5 feet tall. She's precious, but she just looked at me and I didn't know what to say, how to say it. And she just looked at me and she knew. She goes, "It's, 2:30 in the morning. I know it's not good." And that's when I told her, yeah, Pop had to be put on a ventilator.
And so, talk about the last days.
I think for me, the hardest part of the last days was I am in healthcare, so I have this background, this knowledge that my family members did not. So for me, it was I had this feeling I knew he was not going to come out of the hospital. And it's hard for me to say that. It's just, I can't explain it. I just knew. Um, I tried to remain hopeful, but it was just something inside me. What was strange to me about the last few days was everything started to improve, which to this day, I just don't understand. They were talking to me about weaning him off the ventilator and how that process works and how it was a slow process, but this is how it works. His chest x ray had improved. All of his labs had shown improvement. Even down to the morning that he died, his vital signs were stable at 6:30 in the morning. Then I get a call at 8:30 that morning saying, "You need to get down here. We think he's getting ready to code. His lips are turning blue." So to hear everything is improving and you're talking to me one minute about weaning him off the ventilator and he's going to come off the ventilator to he's getting ready to code, I was just in shock. So confusing, so shocking. I still have all these unanswered questions in my mind, and because everything had improved. And some people say that, some people had told me, okay, well, you know, with COVID, people they seem to do well at first. Then they seem to reach this plateau period, and it's how long can their body hold on during this plateau period to see if they can beat the virus or if they can't.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought when everything had improved, he was going to beat it.
Yeah.
Um,
Had he been retested for COVID during that time he was in the hospital?
he was, yes, several times, and I felt like I knew because my dad had, you know, a history of pulmonary fibrosis. I knew that his tests, whether he's contagious or not, would show up positive for a while. So it did.
Mm-hmm.
And his last test that he had was December 31st, and he was still testing positive. So it was, I just had so many unanswered questions, and I wanted answers. And so it took me a few weeks. I reached out to the pulmonologist because I wanted answers.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where being a healthcare worker is a double edged sword for me because I feel like I didn't get the answers, or maybe I didn't get the answers I was looking for. I did get answers, but it felt to me like, well, your dad got septic and died. He just couldn't hold on. And it was like so cold and so nonchalant
Mm-hmm.
that I understand you're a healthcare worker and this is your job. You do this all the time. I understand how chaotic the world is, and I'm sure you're being bombarded by a million other daughters, a million other family members with questions and wanting answers. And, at the time, there's just not that many answers to give. But here's where the compassion should come in.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where wording would mean everything, because here's somebody's daughter who's used to seeing her dad every single day, and now there's nothing. And you just want to tell me, well, he got sepsis and died. His body couldn't hold on. And if you have any other questions, feel free to give me a call. And that was that.
Yeah.
And I guess I feel like a little more heart, a little bit more compassion would have been nice at the time.
Mm-hmm. So your dad was able to improve to a degree in the last few days, and then it all just happened very quickly.
Yes. And that was what was so shocking for me, so hard
Mm-hmm.
to understand, was that they were telling me we're going to start weaning him off of his vent settings. He's improving. His chest x-ray shows a lot of improvement. His white count at one point, a normal white blood cell count is 5 to 10,000. Well, his white count at one point was 37 and it had came down.
Mm-hmm.
So everything was showing signs of improvement, signs of hope that he was going to make it. So the day that I got that phone call, I was just floored. Another thing was, I told you earlier that I remembered walking down the hallway the night he got put on the ventilator.
Mm-hmm.
Something I really probably will never forget was when I got the call that he was going to code, and my husband rushed me down to the hospital. We live about 5 minutes away from it. And I got there, and there's my dad, and he wasn't moving. And there was a nurse in the room, and she was taking off his stockings, and I knew he was gone. And here I am alone. And to my right is a group of like 15, 20 healthcare workers, and not one single one of them came up to me and said, I'm sorry, or anything.
They were just very clinically in the room.
Yeah, they were just over by the nurse's desk, just standing in a circle together, talking.
Mm.
And here's a daughter, and I'm standing there, and I just lost the most important person in my life. And nobody came over to me, and I was alone. Eventually, the attending came up and just said, I'm sorry. Would you like to go to a room and sit down for a minute? But it took a good 10 minutes of me standing there alone by myself, looking at my dad. And this nurse is taking off of his stuff before anybody came up to me. So I was just alone. And I'll never forget that. It's something that'll stay with me forever.
Yeah. So he passed away in January.
Yes, on January the 5th.
Yeah. And were you able to have a memorial service or a funeral for him?
We were able to have a funeral in the church. It was very limited in the number of people. It was very small because of everything going on, and made sure my mom had a mask on and I had a mask on. We all had mask on. And
Yeah. So one thing uh, is you are in the middle of, well, you're nearing the end of your first year. And because we just finished Thanksgiving and we're headed into the Christmas season, and your dad was in the
yeah,
hospital during the holiday, how are you? How are you as a family, and how are you coping with all of this and with your feelings and with the memories? Because I know that every single day for me, every single day, every single call, every single thing is right there, fresh in my mind still, even though it was almost a year and a half ago. So I'm assuming it's similar for you and just going through all of these days and the things that happened. How are you coping with that right now? And what are you doing to take care of yourself?
um, it is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I I agree, much like you. Every day is hard. Every day I wake up, I feel like, is that day, is that phone call. And what's hard is when I get a patient who's telling me, oh, I had COVID, our whole family had it, it was a piece of cake, I beat it, or I just have a sinus infection, I've been vaccinated, so I don't want a COVID test. That's hard, um, to hear those things. So I've decided a while back, right after he passed away, I wrote a story to help me cope. A story about my dad. And then in September, I thought, I'll just share this story because writing this story helped me to remember all the good times that I had with my dad. So maybe if I shared this with others, it might help them to remember the good times that they had with their loved ones. So I decided I would give it a shot, and I shared it on Nextdoor. And about 24 hours later, someone from the news contacted me and was like, we love your story about your dad. And, we'd like to help you with this project that you're starting. And I was taken aback because what started out as something to help me cope and to help me heal has now evolved into helping others. So that was very reassuring. So this project is one of the ways that's helping me to heal. And now I'm hearing from others that it's helping them to heal. So that
Yeah.
means it's a huge deal to me. It's my way to turn something very horrible into something positive to help others, because my dad, he would help anybody that needed it. He he was that kind of guy. He repaired appliances, and if a customer couldn't afford it, he would accept like honey or preserves as payment. And my mom would just be shaking her head like, honey, honey, honey. He said, well, they needed their machine fixed, they couldn't afford it, you know. And he always kept extra cat and dog food in the back of his truck because we fed literally every stray and brought some of the strays home with us. And again, the look on my mother's face was priceless. But he was just that kind of guy. And I know that he always believed in me and said, you've got a big heart and you have a gift, and your gift is helping others to heal. And he was the one that encouraged me to become a practitioner. He said, "You have this gift, you have this way about you that you could help a million people and you could do it well and with a smile on your face." And so I thought about him in this project, and I wanted to make something of this because he gave me the world, and I think he's not just another number, and his voice deserves to be heard. And so I created Pennies for Pop, and then it just kind of evolved into the Live Like Pop project. And that's one of the ways that I'm able to cope and kind of help myself heal.
Yeah. So, what can people do to be a part of the Pennies for Pop?
It was neat to watch this project evolve, and it's still evolving. I compare it to a butterfly that's just now spreading its wings. So at first it started, like I said, I had posted on Nextdoor and said, if you'd like, you could mail in a card with a penny attached. So that's one way. You can mail in a card with a penny attached, sharing either a photo of your lost loved one or your favorite memories, just a couple of sentences about your favorite memories. And I'm going to create a scrapbook of beautiful memories, which I've already started. And I even had a shelf built to hold this book when it gets finished.
Mhm.
And then I started thinking, I worked with Martha Greenwald, and she has a project of her own, and she writes magic, and she's incredible. And she had suggested offering another option where people could email me their photos and memories. So I'm asking that you can send in a card with a penny attached, or if you'd like to email me your favorite memories, your photos, I can put it on my dad's website, which is livelikepop.org. And it doesn't have to be just a loss from COVID, it can be from anything. And eventually, they're all going to be put on my site, whether it's a mailing card, it'll be turned into. I had to make a bigger coin for stories and memories. So each story or favorite memory becomes a quarter on my website. And each penny is the loved one's photos, and it's all in a gallery on the website. And eventually, I would like to see one day have an actual place where people can go and see their loved ones' pennies,
Mhm.
which I'm going to start the process of working on that. I would like to have a museum or a wall of pennies, but for now, it's you can visit livelikepop.org and email me your photos and favorite memories, or you can send me a card. There's a P.O. box on my website with a penny attached and sharing your favorite photos or favorite memories of your loved ones.
Yeah. That sounds beautiful.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I know that my dad would just he would have that infectious grin on his face. He always had the most beautiful grin, the most beautiful laugh I've ever seen.
Yeah. So, you want it to be some sort of memorial someday.
Yes.
Have you participated in any of the other? Because there are COVID memorials. Have you sent your dad's name into any of those?
I have. I mentioned Martha.
Hmm.
Martha is incredible. I wrote a 7-page story that was essentially my dad's story and my memories with him. And she was like, we really need to condense this so people can read it real quick. So she writes magic and she helped me to recreate it into 3 pages, which she's amazing. And then Rima from Ramie's Heart,
Hmm.
I've just now started to kind of partner with her, and she's been helping me with my project too. So, yes. And I'm having bears bears made from my dad's t-shirt through
Oh.
her project, which I think is incredible. I think at a time right now we all need to work together and be supportive of each other's projects.
Hmm.
I strongly feel like collaboration and being supportive is key, especially right now. There's so much going on in the world, and COVID's not over with, despite what the world wants to think or believe. I mean, we're just getting started. There's already
Hmm.
another variant. So I feel strong that everyone should be supportive of others' projects and help them to grow because they're all unique. They're all beautiful.
Hmm.
Even what you do for people, Jennifer, it's unique and it's beautiful, and that offers a way for people to tell their story and help them remember their loved ones. So everyone's project is unique and beautiful. I strongly feel that everyone needs to work together. So yes, I've been working mainly with those two, with Rima and Martha.
And Martha is the whowelost.org.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. She runs whowelost.org from Kentucky, and she is incredible.
Okay.
Much like you are incredible.
Oh,
And
well.
Rita is
Mhm.
incredible.
I think I think for all of us, it helps us feel less isolated because initially in going through the loss and with everything going on, we feel alone. We feel alone with our grief and the anger and the questions, like you said. There's so many unanswered questions for you. And then when you do get some answers, you get them in this clinical, dry way where you're like, but wait. And in telling their stories and all of the different things that we're doing, we're making sure that they're not forgotten, that they're more than numbers.
Yes, exactly. I feel like I'm never going to get all the answers to my question. There's no amount of medical records that will give me the answers that I need,
Yeah.
but through this project and meeting so many wonderful, supportive people, like I said, has really helped me a lot because when I wrote this story, I was very sad. And then at the same time, I was also very angry because I just didn't understand.
Mhm.
Everything was getting better, and I did feel this sense of alone. And I felt alone at work. I felt alone at home, and my husband is incredible. He is the most supportive, incredible person in the whole world. And I still felt alone. Not that it had anything to do with him personally. It's just I felt alone, and there
Mhm.
was a little bit of me that at the time I was like, well, you don't understand because both of your parents are still here. And so there is this sense of feeling alone. But then, you know, I got to know Martha, and I'm getting to know Rima and you. And through this project, all of these other people that have shared with me, it helps me to not feel so alone. And it also takes away some of the anger and sadness. It makes my heart feel good. I feel like my dad is looking down smiling because I'm taking something and I'm turning it into something beautiful.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I feel like my mom is doing much the same. She would tell me not to wallow. And that's what she would say.
Yeah.
And I think she would be really happy for me that I've managed to turn a lot of anger, because I had a lot of anger,
Yeah,
into something more healing, because it does help. Even though it's sad and we do a lot of crying, it really does help to tell their stories and to talk.
it really does.
Hmm.
It absolutely does. It does something for your heart,
Hmm.
and that it really does help a whole lot. It's helped me at home. It's helped me at work.
Yeah, and let's talk about your work. One of the questions that I always ask people at the end is, "What do you say to people who say COVID isn't real?" And you probably experience that in a much more,
Yes, I experience that on a daily basis.
yeah.
Yeah, yes.
So, what do you say to people who come into your clinic, or who say COVID isn't real, or who balk at the science of it all?
Whew. And what I want to say and what I actually say might be two totally different things.
Yep.
Um, because I love my job as a practitioner, I really do. But through COVID, especially after losing my dad, it's challenging.
Hmm.
Um, I, I keep my dad with me in my heart. I keep his photo on my desk and a plaque next to his photo that says, not all heroes wear capes. Thank you for being my superhero. But I also keep his photo in my white coat pocket. So when there's a patient who tells me that COVID isn't real or they don't want to be tested for it, but they're having symptoms, anything like that, I'll pull out my dad's picture and say, this is my dad. COVID is very real. I lost him to it in January. If you don't want to be tested, I can't force you to. I would never do that. But you are, in fact, having symptoms, and I would recommend testing so that we know how to get you to the resources you need if you need them. So we know how to manage you and treat you and take the best care of you that we can. And it's taken work. It's taken a lot of prayer and a lot of grace on my part to be able to say it like that when on the inside through this time I'm probably wanting to say, like, what in the world is wrong with you? What are you thinking?
Yeah.
Of course you need a test. You can't taste or smell, you know? Um, but I always keep my dad with me. I keep his photo, and it helps keep me grounded. It helps me to remember what I am there to do,
Hmm.
which is to help heal patients, to take the best care of them that I can.
Yeah.
But it's hard. Like I said, it's a double-edged sword. I've mentioned that earlier. It really is because I feel like I have this unique perspective as a healthcare worker. So I understand that healthcare workers they're underappreciated right now. They're overworked. We're having to take extra shifts, work longer hours. We're grumpy when we come home at best, overtired, probably don't get enough sleep.
Hmm.
But on the other end of it, I lost my dad to COVID. So if it takes me staying at work a little bit longer, and most recently I had in my clinic a grandson, and we close at 6, and he signed in his 97-year-old grandmother at like 5:55. And it's hard in a clinic where you see 60 to 100 people a day. And you could believe me that when 6 o'clock rolls around, you're ready to run.
Yeah.
You're ready to run out of there because, you know, just like everyone else. I have a family too. I have a husband, a son that I'd like to get home and see, but my heart also goes out to those people. So I agreed to stay, and I ended up staying until 7, and thankfully I really appreciated the grandson at the end of it, and you know, he said, "Thank you so much for staying and taking care of my grandmother. I'm
Mhm.
sorry I signed in late. She was in an assisted living facility, and they just called me at like 4:45, so I had to go get her and bring her to get tested and treated, and that made me feel good to know that there are people out there who still will say thank you for doing that, because I realize that you're going to be late getting home to your family. Just
Yeah.
that little bit means a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
But as a healthcare worker who lost someone, it's I know my dad would have been proud of me that night.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that he said that this was your calling.
Yeah. So I just saw the lady, and I saw this 97-year-old lady, so sweet, and she was in a wheelchair, and I did not have the heart to say no, I'm not going to see her, because it's 5:55, or I'm ready to go home. I was ready to go home, but I wanted to take care of her too. My dad would have wanted me to taken care of her.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the time today and sharing your story of you and your dad and your family and live like Pop and what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I love what you're doing as well, Jennifer. You're doing a huge service to everyone who participates.
Thank you. Yeah, both of us, I'm sure, would say it's a labor of love.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I 110% agree. It is a labor of love,
Yeah.
a very strong, deep love.
And that's the show, everyone. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please share the show. Share it with your friends, share it on your social media, and once you've done that, rate and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And then go rate it on Apple Podcast, because that's where most of our new listeners come from. Ratings and reviews are the main way this podcast finds new listeners. So please share the show. Until next time.